My name is Sari van Pooijen, and I'm the director of Intact Academy and of Team Agility. Within Intact Academy, we train people to become coaches, executive coaches, team coaches, and supervisors. And within Team Agility, we help big businesses and small businesses innovate more quickly than their products. What that means is that we help them to refocus on their customers, integrate innovation and exploitation, and create new and unusual partnerships when the times get rough and even when they don't. Now, for us at the moment, of course, times are rough because in this generation, we haven't experienced such a pandemic before. If we look historically, of course, many more people died during the First World War, during the Spanish flu, during the Second World War. But for this generation, we have never experienced a situation where the government actually took control over our personal freedom to go out, to stay in, how to work, how to shop, etc. So one of the reasons that I'm really fascinated in this time is because I'm looking at cultural scripting. And a cultural script is the pattern that cultures repeat when times are rough. You could say that we all of us have in us not only a personal script, which is based on our personal history, but also a cultural script, which is based on the societal norms and ways of doing things. Sometimes here at home, we joke, this isn't the way my clan would do it. This isn't the way my tribe would do it, just to stress the fact that there is no right and wrong, but that all of us grow up in a tribal situation, in a culture where we learn unconsciously to value things which aren't true, but those are the ways you do things within your clan. Within transactional analysis, we describe that as a cultural script matrix. And really we say there are three elements to this. So the first element is we learn etiquette. And etiquette is a has to. Values, norms, ethics. So for instance, eating with knife and fork may be true in one clan, and that's etiquette. We even call that etiquette. We call that parental introjection, but that's like for the technical people amongst us. But in another tribe, perhaps eating with your hands is the norm, and eating with knife and fork would be the wrong thing to do. So etiquette is culturally bound. We have to remember that, but it is a has to. We talk about the second element, which is technique. And technique embraces all the concepts, technology, methods we learn how to be successful in a tribe. So it's a supposed to, if you want to name it. So for instance, in one tribe, it might be a technicality or a technique to become academically brilliant because, for instance, here in Holland, knowledge workers are the norm. They earn the most here. Where in other countries, perhaps working with your hands is much more respected and is much more respected as a technique as well. So if you're a great fisherman in Greece, it will be much more respected as a technique than being an IT person. The third element of cultural scripting, we call that character. And character is really interesting. So the formal definition is the degrees of freedom you have to be yourself within the context of the culture. So some cultures are very determining, so they give very little room for your personal character, and some cultures give a lot of freedom. So for instance, I lived in Saudi Arabia in the 1990s, 80s and 90s. In that culture at that time, the degrees of freedom were minimal. So when I came, I was a girl in puberty, blonde hair, blue eyes. I wore full chador because I wasn't allowed to go out with anyone except for my father. There was a lot of stuff I wasn't allowed to do. And so the degrees of freedom in that culture at that time were very small. Here in Holland, we are very used to having a lot of degrees of freedom. So we consider it a right to be ourselves in a group. Now, I have to say, this is never possible. Anyone who becomes a member of a group always has to give up part of their character. So the payoff is you get belonging in return for adaptation. And there's no way around it. But the measure of adaptation belonging is balanced depending on your culture. So character is really associated with I'd like to. So etiquette is has to, technique is supposed to, and character is like to. We see that this cultural script comes up more in times where there's dramatic events like COVID. And Pearl Drago used to write about unhealthy cultural scripting. Pearl Drago is a teaching and supervisor in transactional analysis in India. And she worked a lot in the slums, and she did a lot to empower women in the slums in India. And she always talked about unhealthy cultural scripting because she had a dilemma. You know, some of the rules in India are very clear about women and about divorce and about, you know, if a husband dies, what happens to the woman afterwards. And she said, I don't know if I should respect the culture or I should empower the women, and where that balance is. So she created a way of thinking about what is unhealthy cultural scripting. And she said, well, unhealthy cultural scripting is always based on the concept of supremacy. So that means I'm better than you are. I'm more okay than you are. So it's based on a plus minus position, we would say in TA. And you can recognize it by the fact that history repeats itself over and over again. So you see patterns in the history of a culture. People keep things the way they are because they're familiar, not because they're helpful. You see unhealthy cultural scripting in a nation when the government assumes responsibility for others that they can assume for themselves. And they punish new behavior even though it's healthy. And you can also recognize an unhealthy cultural script if a nation creates control for the sake of control and not for the sake of safety. So if we look at the differences in the reaction to COVID, I really admire, I have to say, the way the Dutch government has reacted. So I've grown up an expat child. We moved country every 3 years. And now for the past 2 years, I've been back in Holland. And there are very few times I feel Dutch. As I said, the cultural scripting comes up in unusual times. So there are times I feel very Dutch and very proud of being Dutch. And this COVID time is one of those times that I feel really proud. The reason for it is that our government has set up a way of dealing with this while respecting the autonomy of the people. So what you can see in Holland is that the government has set guidelines, and if people followed them, they've left them as guidelines. If people cross the boundaries of the guidelines, they've upped the ante and created rules. If people followed the rules, they left the autonomy of the people. If people didn't follow the rules for safety, then they upped the ante and enforced them. So what you could see in Holland is really this play of, on the one hand, belonging, because they kept stressing the only way we will get out of COVID is by doing it together. Everywhere in Holland, you could see this. So a lot of stress on belonging, doing it together, doing things for each other. And on the other hand, this interplay between setting guidelines, setting rules, and enforcing as people were following or not following the rules. Very interesting way of doing it. And I have a lot of respect for the way they communicated this and they set this up. In other countries, I hear, because I haven't been there, so this is hearsay, But I have clients in Serbia where we see, or in Hungary, where we actually see a resurgence of almost military rule. So you see curfews, you see unexpected communication or incoherent policy. You see a resurgence of old ways of doing things instead of new thinking of how can we keep the autonomy of the people, not do control for control, but do control as for safety. And as long as people are safe, then relinquish control again. You see in some countries like Serbia and Hungary, or I could name other countries, but those are the countries I know. So where the government is assuming responsibility for others instead of enforcing people to assume responsibility for themselves. Because in the end, what you want to create is an interdependent state. And the moment that you see unhealthy cultural scripting, what you get is a state of dependency. And that means if you create a state of dependency, that some people are going to be in control and others are going to adapt. And as soon as you create that, you diminish the potential for people to be agile and to be innovative in a culture.